Chapter 13 Settling Down. Vagabonds of the Air. In the summer of 1929, despite warnings from some critics that the economy was overheated and the stock market dangerously overpriced, Transcontinental Air Transport (TAT) decided to expand its business by offering the first ever coast-to-coast travel service. Recent developments in aircraft technology had made this possible. In 1925, soon it was producing the Tin Goose, the first all-metal multi-engine, 3 in total, commercial airplane, sumptuously equipped with velvet-cushioned wicker chairs, individual reading lamps, and electric cigar lighters with ashtrays. The plane could carry a crew of 3, pilot, co-pilot, and captain and cabin steward, as well as 9 passengers. Despite the necessity of landing every 250 miles to refuel, the plane could cross the country in just 48 hours, 40 hours faster than a train. This time savings, however, came with a big price tag. At $351.94, about $5,000 today, a one-way flight on TAT cost twice as much as the most expensive railroad accommodation. Understanding the need to appeal to the wealthiest travelers, TAT officials upped the company's snob appeal by giving every passenger on the transcontinental run a solid gold fountain pen from Tiffany & Co. TAT also sought to enhance its name recognition and reputation by dubbing itself the Lindbergh line, since the famous pilot had agreed to lend both his name and his services to the company in exchange for that lucrative stock-sharing deal. And so, fresh from their honeymoon, Charles and Anne took to the air, crisscrossing the country to christen the new airports along the TAT's cross-country route. Everywhere they went, they were followed by whirring newsreel cameras and popping flash bulbs. It was the kind of attention of which Charles approved, publicity for aviation, proof that plane travel was fast, efficient, and above all safe. And Anne became TAT's unofficial hostess, smiling alongside her husband. Still, the couple remained always on guard. "We avoided all personal questions," said Anne, speaking in discreet banalities. And banalities. Banalities. Vagabonds of the air, they called no place home, living in hotels and embassies and other people's houses. Charles made it clear that his wife was not going to sit at home waiting for him. Where he went, she went, and he was the one who decided where they were going. Anne resented this at first, and there he is, darn it all, the great Western strongman, open spaces type, and a life of relentless action, she wrote early in their relationship. But after all, what am I going to do about it? To have Anne merely as a passenger in his plane would have been a waste of weight and space. No, she would be a working partner, a member of his crew. Charles expected her to learn to work a radio, become an expert in Morse code, and plot a course with charts and compass. Above all, she needed to learn to fly. Charles, of course, would be her teacher. Concerned for her safety, he bought a special training plane said to be so easy to handle, one could land it in a tree. But he was a perfectionist. On her first day of instruction, sitting behind her in the control plane, he told her bluntly that he'd rather have a non-pilot than a poor pilot, and got his point. Sometimes he had her flying out of the Long Island Aviation Club 2 or 3 hours a day, landing and taking off, landing and taking off. Time and again she'd bring the plane down with a bump and a bounce and a sigh of relief, only to have him say, "Not good, take her up again." On August 24th, Anne soloed. From the clubhouse porch, Charles watched her take off and circle for several minutes before gracefully bringing the plane back down to earth. Charles grinned, and Anne felt glorious. For the first time, I had a sense of value in the real world of life and action, she said, like the bird pushed out of the nest. I was astonished that, flapping hard, I could fly. Now Charles's mind filled with new possibilities for flights. Truth was, he hadn't realized how lonely he'd been until he'd married Anne. Her being in the back cockpit relieved the long, empty hours of flying. The touch of her hand on his neck, the silly note passed forward because it was impossible to talk over the engine's roar. It had changed him. He still wanted to fly, but now he wanted to fly with his wife. That fall, Charles also began his work for Pan American Airways, Pan Am. The airline had originally been an airmail carrier, but its officials had recognized the potential for passenger airlines around the same time as TAT, and they too had offered Charles a handsome contract back in 1927. But Pan Am's sights were set on a different territory, Central and South America. They wanted Charles to work out routes spanning the countries in these regions. With Anne behind him, he took off for Cuba, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Trinidad, Panama, Colombia, and Nicaragua. Everywhere they went, Charles impressed the crowds. But it was Anne, with her physical stamina and fortitude, who surprised people. So small she could stand upright under her husband's outstretched arm. She hiked alongside him at his quick pace across deserts and through dense jungles. She shinnied up and down ropes to investigate canyons and ruins, camped out in heat and cold and thunderstorms. In March 1930, she allowed Charles to strap her into a glider and propel her over the side of a mountain. She became the first woman to earn a glider's pilot license, although it was not a thrill she longed to repeat. A month later, in a small sports plane Charles had specially designed, he and Anne broke the transcontinental speed record, flying from Los Angeles to New York in a mere 14 hours, 45 minutes, 3 hours faster than the previous record. And then the first couple of the sky, as newspapers called them, did something really surprising. They hung up their flying suits and secluded themselves at Next Day Hill. Anne was 7 months pregnant. Eaglet. On June 22nd, 1930, Anne's 24th birthday, a tired but joyful Charles sent a telegram to his mother in Detroit. Advise purchasing property. It was a code Charles had shared with Evangeline weeks earlier, meant to confuse reporters. If the baby was a girl, he would send a telegram reading, advise accept terms of contract. For a boy, it would read, advise purchasing property. Evangeline had a grandson, Charles Augustus Lindbergh, Jr. Gazing down at her 6-pound, 7-ounce newborn for the first time, Anne thought, "Oh dear, it's going to look like me." Dark hair and a nose all over its face. Then she saw the unmistakable cleft in the chin, and she went to sleep quite happy. Charles did not record how he felt about his newborn son. The day after the baby's birth, churches everywhere said special prayers and blessings for him. A choir director in Florence composed a lullaby in his honor. The congregants of the Magyar Evangelical Reformed Christian Church in Gary, Indiana, named their church the Charles A. Lindbergh Jr. Cathedral Chapel, and some members of Congress even suggested his birthday be declared a national holiday. At Next Day Hill, the doorbell kept ringing. Poems, letters, flowers, presents, songs, all this and more poured in. They came from around the world, and mostly from strangers. A candy maker forwarded a specially created box of Lindy Jr. Pure Honey Kisses. Parents Magazine offered the Lindberghs a free subscription. A Hollywood director sent along a small movie camera. A California rancher sent a pony. So many people wanted to forward their good wishes that a Boston printing company created a special greeting card for the occasion that read, "Congratulations to the happy Lindberghs. Bushels of them arrived at the Morrow's estate." But as months passed, the tone of this correspondence began to shift. Good wishes turned to appeals for money. People began begging for help instead of autographs, and more than 200 new parents wrote and asked for the baby's outgrown clothing. Surely a hero like Charles Lindbergh can spare something, anything, insisted one letter writer. Neither Charles nor Anne responded to these requests, but they understood their meaning. Americans were feeling the strains of the Great Depression. Crash. There is something about too much prosperity that ruins the fiber of people, Charles said one evening in October 1930. He looked down the china and crystal-laden dining table toward Dwight Morrow. Did his father-in-law agree? The men were discussing the economic downturn. A year earlier, on October 24th, 1929, the stock market had crashed, plunging the entire nation into an economic tailspin. Although only a small percentage of Americans had invested in the market, the impact of plummeting stock prices was quickly felt across the country. Many banks hard hit when the stock investors were unable to pay back their loans, closed their doors. The life savings of millions of Americans were wiped out, and businesses began failing at an alarming rate, leaving more and more people without jobs. In the past year, 1 in 4 Americans had found themselves out of work. Stores were closed, factories and mines stood idle, and millions of workers roamed the cities looking for employment. Hungry Americans stood in long lines at charity soup kitchens or foraged in garbage cans. Homeless Americans built makeshift shelters out of scrap iron, packing boxes and other thrown away items, and some piled their remaining belongings into their cars and headed west, searching for a better life. They didn't find it. It seemed suffering and despair were everywhere except at Next Day Hill, within the manicured borders of the Morrow's estate. Maids still polished silver. The cook still whipped up delicious meals served by the white-gloved butler. The chauffeur still waited beside the gleaming Rolls-Royce, ready to drive the family wherever it wished, as if living in their own fairy tale. The Lindberghs and Morrows went untouched by the Depression. With the help of their friends at J.P. Morgan and Company, both men's fortunes had survived the stock market crash almost intact. As servants moved around the table, Charles went on with his thoughts about the economic crisis. It will furnish a fine test of American capability and character, he declared. That he wasn't being tested himself did not seem to occur to him. It had occurred to Dwight Morrow, however. The previous January he'd left his ambassadorial position in Mexico and returned to New Jersey to run for and win election to a vacated seat in the United States Senate. Now he often lay awake at night worrying about the growing numbers of hungry and homeless. Still, Morrow chose not to contradict his son-in-law. He'd learned it was easier to hold his tongue than to argue with Charles. Eventually, as Morrow had hoped, the conversation drifted to other subjects. Despite living under the same roof, the two men had not bonded. Instead, they treated each other with utmost politeness, so much so that Charles always felt like a weekend guest. He detested not being in charge. Not long after the baby's birth, Charles decided it was time to build his own home. He'd already purchased the land 425 acres of fields and woodlands in New Jersey's Sauerland Mountains. It even had its own little brook. Best of all, it was private. No one except a few poor farmers lived nearby, and the closest town, Hopewell, was 3 miles away. An architect was currently drawing up plans for a house, and some of the acreage had been cleared and leveled for an airstrip. Charles spent much of his time there, chopping down trees and supervising construction. Still, it would be another year before their new home was ready. Anne, meanwhile, settled into motherhood. She'd fallen in love with little Charles. Not immediately, but over time and through a series of terribly dear moments. She called him her fat lamb, and confessed that it broke her heart every time she left him to go shopping or out to tea with her mother. She worried that Charles would want to return to flying long distances soon. She knew she couldn't She knew he couldn't remain earthbound for long. So she was overwhelmed with relief when he suddenly directed his passion and energy toward an earthbound question that had nagged at him since childhood. Why couldn't people live forever?